Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to a post on memory thieves and control variables. It is a pleasant combination of analysis and some cultural context that you've probably never heard about before. So, once upon a time, there was a world in which memories were used as currency. In this world, there were two classes of people: the underclass and those who were allowed to steal memories from the underclasses. A shadow organization was born unto this world, and its mission was to restore the stolen memories to their rightful owners. This is the premise of a recently published book by Lauren Manzi called The Memory Thief. But given the realities of the publishing industry today, I wondered if her book was a novel or a business plan. In some ways, it reminded me of a reframing of the basic problem described in Harry Potter. Yes, Harry Potter, where a dark wizard drank unicorn blood to become powerful again after his murder of Harry's mother had weakened him. Perhaps he got defriended. Since unicorn is a code word for talented people or groups, a Death Eater might be thought of as a person who emulated the Dark Wizard by feeding off of the deaths of talented people, sort of like a murderous plagiarist. Given the proliferation of automated plagiarism and the growth of monolithic publishing, a monolithic publishing industry, which protects best-selling plagiarists, if such an apparatus were coupled to an automated procedure through which the deaths of discreetly eliminated dangerous people, unknown creative people, and undercover security workers could be converted into profitable products like zombie bank accounts of people who buy lots of ebooks, or into the ingredients for rehashed literature, one has a perfect recipe for a culture of death eating within the publishing industry. And sometimes you can find books where by industry insiders that seem to have their own way of telling people what is really going on. In this one, I wonder, the protagonist is responsible for dealing with a crypt, and there's a very insider-outsider mentality. Of course, it would be nonsense to suspect that J.K. Rowling knew of such things when she invented Death Eaters back in the 1990s, long before the internet transformed publishing. Yet it would be hard to deny that groups which profit from state-sanctioned death have come into being in our modern economy. Is this pre-science? Anti-science? A delusional death-eating cult's effort to slow the progress of technology and slow the approach of the end of the world? I think I'm letting my inner fiction writer run amok again. I've spent a lot of time going through the 5 books that seem to have plagiarized mine within 2 years after I self-published, and I find evidence of a methodical, almost algorithmic approach to copying my story and repainting it to look appropriate for various genres. In Individutopia, there was a version of socialism preached that smacked of exceptionalism, kind of like Nazis, whereas I gave the protagonist dignity despite adversity. He depicted her getting ridden by a half-human dogman. In Midnight Library, I saw the stupidest explanation of suicidal depression that I've ever seen. Depression doesn't arise due to regrets alone. It arises due to conflict, pressure, and damage caused by all sorts of things. Una Out of Order depicted a shallow woman who consistently made childish decisions even though she was an adult. Her level of self-awareness never increased. The Red Labyrinth was a mashup of recent movies glued together with my story stripped of nuance. Her world was black and white, where powerful people are all uniformly evil thieves. Lastly, there was Piranesi, a book that posed as high-minded, but Really, all it did was bury a rather simple storyline from my book within hundreds of pages of irrelevant world building and flowery poetic language that did nothing to drive the story forward. It gave the audience the feeling that they were reading something profound when they'd actually just been sold a pile of meaningless obfuscation that was challenging to decipher. So, after your book gets stolen by 5 different publishing industry insiders, you start to wonder, why? What's going on? Do they think I'm dead? Hey, Death Eaters, I'm not dead yet. A cynical reader would suggest that I'm only seeing what I hope to find, and that I might see the same number of sequential similarities in any other book from the genre. I think it is easy to quantitatively prove this wrong. This is important because when AIs can hack together and spin new stories from old, disguising the stolen material beneath thesaurus sorcery, authors need a systematic, quantitative method to diagnose when someone has taken too much of their intellectual property in the creation of their derivative work. We all have our influences, but the difference between plagiarism and inspiration is in how those influences are used. And as I mentioned in a previous post, the length of the sequences that have been copied. Sequences of words, sequences of ideas. If the source book, movie, or writer must sit next to the author while he writes, either in digital form or in hard copy, I think he is committing a crime if he copies too much and doesn't attribute those sources. In the EU, the standard for copyright infringement is when 14 sequential plot elements are copied, and this might be connected to how people's working memory functions. Given the structure of the human brain, we generally only remember about 10 alphanumeric elements in sequence. If one is only required to remember letters, then the average person can remember 15 letters. People generally can't remember more than 20 letters or numbers in a sequence, unless they have trained themselves to use a 3-dimensional memory palace. So we see evidence of how the human working memory is structured in our languages. Words don't tend to have more than 15 letters. Sentences don't tend to have more than 15 words. Paragraphs don't tend to have more than 15 sentences, and so on. So we tend to compress data in our minds in a very predictable fashion, and this shows up in our literature. And when we build a memory palace, we are storing things in a 3-dimensional space rather than compressing things down to 1-dimensional strings. A story is a good way to build a memory palace, and it provides an example of how it is easier to remember things happening in a 3-dimensional world than it is to remember a sequence of seemingly unrelated concepts. It is when we try to compress a world down to 1 dimension that we lose the ability to remember the details. Our minds are 3-dimensional after all. In my effort to prove that certain authors have stolen my memory palace or my original story, I will compress several stories down to 1-dimensional sequences of events, and I will record the page numbers that coincide to a similar event happening in both books. If the simultaneous plot elements have been extracted from the same source and appear in sequential order, there will be perfect correlation, and all points will lie on a line that defines the story arc of the source material. When there are more than 14 points on this line, copyright infringement has occurred. If the simultaneous plot elements occur in a random distribution, the level of influence may be determined by the number of plot elements, but there is little reason to suspect that the material has been plagiarized. The author has clearly done something new with the material. To test this hypothesis, I'm taking 2 books that reminded readers of the book that I think copied mine, The Midnight Library, and I will use them to generate the same sort of chart that I've used to compare my book to The Midnight Library. So the books in question are My Adorable Apotheosis. I published that in 2018. Matt Haig published The Midnight Library in October 2020. And Una Out of Order was published by Margarita Montemore in October 2020 also. And it is strangely similar to The Midnight Library, and in what follows you'll find out why. Lastly, as my control variable, I have Maybe in Another Life by Taylor Jenkins Reid. It was published in 2015, and many readers of both The Midnight Library and Una Out of Order have said, hey, this book reminds me of Maybe in Another Life. So I'm going to see how similar it is to Maybe in Another Life and how similar the book is to my book, and you'll see a big difference. So another little interesting bit is that Maybe in Another Life seems to have been inspired by a 1998 film called Sliding Doors, starring Gwyneth Paltrow. And when I compare this control variable with my book and Matt Haig's book, and The Midnight Library, and with Margarita Montemore's book Una Out of Order, I don't find that many plot overlaps. I found a maximum of, let's see, six plot overlaps. And none of them are arranged terribly sequentially. And I find it kind of interesting that all it takes for a large number of readers to say, hey, this book is very similar to one I read before, is 4 plot overlaps, 4 relatively unique concepts that kind of provide a fingerprint or an identifying feature that people recognize as similar. And then in contrast, so we only have 6 similarities between these books. If I compare The Midnight Library with my book, there are 55 sequential plot elements, and they're all arranged one after the other where things are happening on the same page in both books. So this is just night and day. There's an order of magnitude of more similarity compared with this book, Maybe in Another Life, that readers identified as the genealogical predecessor of The Midnight Library. They were wrong. The Midnight Library was an illegal ripoff of My Adorable Apotheosis, and Maybe in Another Life was a red herring. So I recommend clicking on the blog post below where you can find all of the data I took on these with page numbers, and it's all plotted out. It's not that complicated. I mean, every grade school child learns that if you need to have the source material sitting next to you as you type, you need to cite the source, otherwise you are plagiarizing. And it doesn't matter if you are taking 55 words in sequence or 55 sentences, 55 concepts in sequence. I think people understand that that's copying, because that's just not how the human memory works. That's not how the creative process works. And now I do the same thing. Now I call up that issue of readers noticing that there were a lot of similarities between Una Out of Order and Midnight Library, 2 books that were published within the same exact month. And I did an analysis of those similarities, and I found a lot. There were like 35, but they weren't all perfectly sequentially organized like they were in my comparison with my book and The Midnight Library. So I wasn't expecting that when I started to write this blog post. So after that, I did the comparison of my book with Una Out of Order, and there I found even more similarities, and they were more sequentially organized on the page. So with respect to page numbers, so where the events all happen in the same order in both books. Now, compared to Matt Haig's book, The Midnight Library, the type of copying or the type of inspiration or copying, whatever, it was kind of in the gray area, done in Una Out of Order, it was less perfectly sequential. So it was a little bit more rearranged, more out of order, and in keeping with the title. But it does seem to approach that 14-point threshold that was set as an EU standard in J.K. Rowling versus Tanya Grotter and The Magical Double Bass. If the author were honest about how she constructed the work, I would personally put it in the gray area of copyright violation. But she didn't do that. So as you'll see, things are weirder than I expected. What's really strange is that both authors of The Midnight Library and Una Out of Order are cross-promoting one another, as in they stole from the same source and are now in cahoots? They're promoting each other? How weird is that? It's like they both got the same tips. They're both in the same circle or circuit of passing around stolen book outlines or something. I mean, I have these links to their YouTube video and where they both showed up on a show for Flatiron Books. It's just very disturbing. And the fact that Matt Haig, first of all, I have a letter from him or from his publisher stating that he's never seen my book before and he doesn't believe he's copied anything from it. Mrs. Montemore, for Una Out of Order, she stated in an interview with Roz Morris of Nail Your Novel that Una Out of Order was not directly inspired by any single book. She only mentioned The Time Traveler's Wife. Yet, in the years leading up to its publication, she was a book coach and editor, so I think she could have been exposed to my book. And I think that the number of things taken from my book, it eventually has to lead to an admission of some form of wrongdoing, because it's simply not possible that this set of details in these sorts of sequences, that this happens randomly. It's simple, sorry book people, there's something called math, and when books and math collide, party's over. No, you're not fooling anybody. That's the truth. And the legal profession, they're very word oriented, but there'll be some people there who understand math too. So, oops. And with that, I just want to say that my goal in this is to help show authors who've been a victim of this type of plagiarism how to go about analyzing the books in question, how you have to go through and you really have to ask yourself what's happening on this page, what's happening on this page, and think about things you have to zoom in. You have to start out with a very conceptual picture of each book and figure out what the broad brush strokes are that were used to construct the books. And then a lot of authors get stuck in the details where they only can focus on whether or not sentence fragments were copied. And this happens too. And depending on the length of the sentences that, say, some sort of writing assistant delivers to the author, you end up with either sentence fragments or even whole scenes taken from other books and put into a plagiarized version of someone else's work. This has been happening in the romance novel community extensively, where whole scenes are copied, and it makes one wonder if it's being facilitated by, you can make a database of romance novels and have it sort itself, and you type in a keyword or you start a sentence and it gives you some ideas about what sorts of sentences might follow that kind of sentence. that's how modern plagiarism is starting to come together. But that's not the type of plagiarism I've seen here. This is more like a very detailed 55-point outline being passed around as though it never came from anybody else's book. And it came from mine. So I think this is going to be sorted out in the coming years, but it's going to take time. And my recommendation to an author who thinks their book has been copied is to choose a selection of books from the same genre and with the same premise. Read each book while remembering as much as possible from the other books. Write down the page numbers on which similar things are happening on similar pages. Then chart out those page numbers for each book. And if the elements you see on your chart are in a sequence, they'll be on a line, a sort of diagonal line. And if there are more than 14 points on that line, and if those plot elements are all relatively unique, well, you should even write down the non-unique plot elements, because they kind of combine. The longer a sequence gets, the more lengthy it is, and sometimes you don't realize that there is a sequence there until you have charted it out. And then you can present your findings in a dispassionate, scientific style. So we need to give writers some scientific muscle to defend themselves, and I hope that people answer the call to arms to fix this problem. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something and just feel like the world got a little bit wider for you. Because whenever we're searching for information, we're trying to extend our view past this little cage we find ourselves in, and it's so hard to connect all of the pieces of the world that we see because we're only shown little fragments. And I think we're all really hungry for those wide-ranging connections. That's probably why people turn to spiritual concepts, because they reach out and they find those big connections that make people feel like the world makes sense, which sometimes it doesn't usually. Until next time.